Nous sommes très très heureux d'accueillir aujourd'hui Mischa Gabowitsch et Mykola Homanyuk pour que eux puissent présenter leur nouvel livre qui est consacré au monument territoire, le mémorial de la guerre en Ukraine occupée par la Russie. Je pense que le sujet il est compliqué, mais on est très content et on est très intéressé et on est content de écouter ça. Merci beaucoup. Donc, vous pouvez parler comme vous voulez. Euh, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Donc, on nous a demandé de présenter en anglais, mais évidemment, ensuite, s'il y a des questions en français, ukrainien, allemand, anglais ou espagnol, on peut répondre dans ces langues. Donc, I will start by showing you the book cover and a link that you can use to download it. The book is available in a print version, but also in open access. There are several sites from which you can download it. The website of CEU Press is not currently working because it's in the process of becoming part of Amsterdam University Press, and they haven't yet transferred all the links. But there are various sites online where you can download the book for free legally, or you can also order it for your libraries. And that's as much as I will say for now, and now Mykola will start. I will present his part as well, and then if he joins us later, then maybe he will take over from me. So the book starts with the theoretical introduction, which I'm not going to present at great length here, but then we have a long historical chapter because we want to present the historical background against which Russian monument policies unfolded in the occupied parts of Ukraine starting in February 2022. And what's important to understand is that Ukraine, like many other post-Soviet countries, is a place where Second World War monuments abound. There are many, many, many of them. So usually when people write about monuments, and especially war memorials, regardless of the country, they talk about a few individual examples of well-known monuments in large cities, and then they generalize from there. When we were writing the book, we realized very quickly that that was not possible in our case, because in Ukraine, as early as the 1980s, people counted about 40,000 monuments to the Great Patriotic War alone, so to the Second World War in its Soviet understanding. And every single village in Ukraine has at least one of these memorials, if not more. So we have something that in our book we call a monumentscape that is extremely rich and complex. And that for us, it was extremely important to understand in all its complexity and detail, not least because, of course, there are very few large cities among the territories occupied by Russia since 2022. It's mostly just Mariupol and Kherson. Most other places are either small towns or villages. And so accordingly, the monuments, the war memorials that the Russians interacted with are also mostly located in villages and small towns. So we start by giving an overview of Ukraine's monumentscape with an emphasis on local monuments and grassroots practices associated with them instead of going top down from the big cities. And what you can see here is a range of more or less standard looking war memorials from the Soviet period that you will find in small towns and villages across Ukraine, regardless of the region. And what's interesting for our purposes is that even before 2014, and certainly before 2022, Ukrainian residents started modifying these monuments in various ways. So traditionally, since Soviet times, these monuments, which are usually made from very simple materials such as plaster or concrete, were painted in monochrome colors, so silver or gold paint or white paint, mostly to protect them against the elements. What started happening maybe 10 or 15 years ago in Ukraine is that people started repainting them in polychrome color schemes, as you can see here. So individual elements will be repainted in specific colors. stars or medals or orders or other elements of these statues will be singled out using a particular color. And this is something that you find quite widely across different Ukrainian regions. And here are many, many examples. And all of these photos were made by Mykola during his fieldwork in different parts of Ukraine. And you can see here that this happens in different regions, right? So here are examples from the Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Odessa regions. So this is something that's become a very common practice. And interestingly, this really seems peculiar to Ukraine. I have traveled quite widely in other post-Soviet countries, including in rural areas, and I've seen all sorts of interesting modifications of Soviet war memorials, but I've never seen these polychrome color schemes. Here are more examples. And the way we explain this is that in the absence of a central authority defining the ways in which people can interact with these war memorials, people just go wild and let their imagination go crazy. And it's a way of expressing respect for these memorials and showing that people are continuing to interact with them. There are other ways in which war memorials are modified in rural Ukraine. One is by adding additional elements such as, for example, temporary eternal flames or mock eternal flames in locations where no eternal flame existed to begin with. These are more examples of polychromy, and you can see that sometimes the monuments are modified by reimagining Soviet symbols, such as red flags, as symbols of Ukrainian statehood, such as, for example, here, the blue and yellow Ukrainian flag. People also add religious symbols, such as icons, crosses, or other symbols of mostly Orthodox Christianity. I think Mykola has joined us.
Misha, continue, please, because my
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't hear you, which is really a pity because this is all stuff that Mykola collected, and he's much better than me at commenting on it. But okay, let me try. So I was talking about religious modifications, and what you also see are traces of folk commemorative rituals when, for example, people bring candy or fruit or alcoholic drinks or cigarettes to war memorials on various commemorative occasions. Another type of modification, and this is something that you also find in many other post-Soviet countries and even beyond them, is what we call individualization. And this is when you have, for example, a communal grave or some other collective war memorial that lists many different names, and then relatives, descendants of one of the people buried there, or one of the people commemorated there, attach additional individualized markers commemorating that person, very often portraits, but sometimes even sheets of paper with biographical information, etc. And this is something you can see in these photos. Right, these are more examples. So basically you have all these different types of modification which show that people continue to interact with monuments in lots of different ways, and they basically have begun to appropriate them. And there is a hybridization between practices that are applied to family graves on such occasions as Hrobki, for example, which is the Ukrainian equivalent of Radonitsa, so the Orthodox Christian folk commemorative day after Easter. So these practices usually associated with family graves are now also extended to war memorials, even if the people buried there were not originally from the village where they are buried. So there is kind of a domestication and appropriation, which is also evident in the use of, for example, very profane building materials. So I don't think we have the photos in this version of the presentation, but sometimes people will use the same kinds of tiles that they will use to renovate their private bathroom to renovate a war memorial, which is, of course, a sort of a domestication and a way to turn a monument profane and to sort of bring it closer to you, but also, in a sense, to desacralize it. So this is the background against which monument policies unfolded after the full-scale invasion. And one of the first effects of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022 was that a range of war memorials in Ukraine were destroyed. Some of this destruction was probably unintentional, was collateral damage from fighting, but it did also affect war memorials from the Soviet era, which Russia had claimed it was going to Ukraine to protect from a supposed threat from Ukrainian nationalists in Russian parlance. So some of this damage was unintentional, but some was very much deliberate. And one of the very first things they started doing from the very first weeks of the invasion and the occupation is that they targeted, in particular, monuments that featured Ukrainian state or military symbols for destruction. So very often these were monuments built since 2014 and honoring Ukrainian soldiers who died in the anti-terrorist operation, the resistance against Russian intervention since 2014. And here you see photos and videos of this type of destruction. What's interesting is that knowing about this, some local Ukrainian residents actually took measures to protect some of these monuments. So, for example, there's a very widespread phenomenon of commemorative plaques for Ukrainians who died in the anti-terrorist operation being attached to the buildings of schools that they went to as children. And in order to protect them, sometimes school directors would cover them in this black PE foil simply to sort of remove them from public space and make them less interesting for the Russian invaders in terms of destroying them and filming this destruction for a domestic audience. What's interesting is that sometimes the Russians claimed that they would not destroy the Ukrainian memorials or plaques, but instead they would simply remove them from central locations and attach them somewhere else as part of what they called the Museum of the Ukrainian Civil War, because that, of course, was how they framed the war since 2014. But in all our sources, we found only one example where this actually happened in Chornobaivka on the outskirts of Kherson, where they actually did take a commemorative plaque and instead of just destroying it or throwing it away, they moved it to a less central, less public location. Everywhere else, usually the monuments simply disappear. And looking at the discourse, at the language used to describe war memorials in Ukraine, you will often find a very disparaging language where they are presented as somehow inauthentic, illegitimate, and less appropriate than monuments from the Soviet period. What's very interesting in this context is that some monuments that one might have thought would be singled out for destruction were spared by the occupiers. So this is a very interesting example. This is a place in Kherson called the Buskovy Hai, the Lilac Grove, where in the very first days of the invasion, members of Ukraine's territorial defense, so the civilian defense force into which people were drafted to assist the army, were killed fighting the Russian onslaught, and people installed temporary monuments for them. But in this place, there was already a monument commemorating the fallen of the anti-terrorist operation. And here you see a Russian propaganda video that was quite widely circulated, where someone who is presented as a former member of the Ukrainian territorial defense, who has now seen the light and joined the Russian side, is shown blowing up this Atto monument. And this propaganda video is making a big deal of this. So the message is that simple Ukrainians are now understanding that they were victims of Ukrainian propaganda, and now they've joined the Russian side and they're destroying all these illegitimate Ukrainian memorials. What's very interesting about this is that while this monument was being destroyed, these simple makeshift memorials to members of the territorial defense were not touched at all by the Russians, and they actually survived the entire period of the Russian occupation of Kherson and remained intact. And one possible explanation for this is that, in fact, the Russians did not see members of the territorial defense as ideological foes, as they did with the Ukrainian armed forces, and instead they kind of framed them as innocent victims of Ukrainian nationalist policies who were, so to speak, forced to fight Russia. Another interesting example is this. So across Ukraine, you will find a lot of individual memorials, very often memorial plaques, for individual people who died defending Ukraine in the anti-terrorist operation. This is one example from Kherson, a memorial to Ruslan Storcheus, a local policeman who volunteered for the anti-terrorist operation and then was killed in 2014. And here you see it before and after the Russian occupation. What's very interesting about this is that elsewhere in Kherson, there is a memorial built in independent Ukraine, to policemen killed in the line of duty. And it lists, it includes a list of policemen honored there, which goes back to the 1950s, so well into the Soviet period. But it also goes well into the period of independence, and it includes policemen, including Storcheus, who volunteered to fight Russia in the anti-terrorist operation. But what's interesting is that unlike the individual plaque, this one was not destroyed by the Russians. And here our explanation is that apparently they saw this not as a Ukrainian memorial, but as a corporate memorial for policemen. And since they kind of reframed local Kherson policemen as Soviet and therefore Russian, they saw no need to destroy this as a symbol of Ukrainian statehood. But an even more interesting feature of Russian monument policies in the occupied parts of Ukraine was the construction or reconstruction of monuments. So they did destroy a lot of monuments, but they also built some. And what's very interesting here is that the need to protect Soviet-era war memorials from supposed Ukrainian destruction, which was never actually real, was very much part of the official justification for the invasion. So there was one document that was very, very widely circulated in the first months of the invasion on official Russian government websites, even in schools, and which explained why the so-called special military operation was necessary. And one of the points was that supposedly the Ukrainians are destroying all Soviet-era memorials, and we now need to protect them. And this is a part of Russian war propaganda that a lot of people on the Russian side apparently truly believed. And then they were very surprised when they arrived in Ukraine and they saw intact war memorials in very good condition everywhere. So what happened was that they needed to find some way to visually kind of show that they were still somehow reconstructing these monuments. And one important motif was that of the eternal flame. Because they claimed that the Ukrainians had extinguished eternal flames everywhere, which, first of all, it's not true. There are several eternal flames at Second World War memorials throughout Ukraine that burn continuously. Secondly, even in Russia there are over 4,000 eternal flames, but only about a quarter of them actually burn all the time. Others are only lit for special occasions such as Victory Day. But what happened was that it was very important for sort of Russian visual propaganda to show that we are here to rekindle the eternal flame. So they did that in many locations, but even in places where no eternal flame ever existed as part of a memorial to begin with, they wanted to show that they're rekindling it. So this led to bizarre phenomena such as temporary eternal flames. So they came with gas tanks, and just for a video, or just for a Victory Day celebration or some other commemorative occasion, they lit this eternal flame to show that now Russia is back and is doing this. Another interesting phenomenon is spurious reconstruction. So, as I said, war memorials from the Soviet era were actually, with very few exceptions, treated very well in Ukraine until 2022. They were not destroyed in the decommunization campaigns of 2015, 2016, because they were not, monuments of political leaders, etc. So, what do the Russians do when they arrive? Well, first of all, they discover this phenomenon of polychromy that I mentioned at the very beginning. And their initial reaction was that, well, this is blasphemous. This is not something that we do to war memorials. This is unacceptable. But then very quickly, when they start producing propaganda images and videos for an audience back home, they start co-opting these practices and kind of presenting them as their own. And to me, as a historian, this is really interesting because this essentially continues a process that started in the Soviet Union during the Second World War, when again and again, within the larger framework set by the Soviet authorities for war memory and war commemoration, people locally would come up with new practices, new commemorative practices, new traditions, things that were not handed down to them from Moscow or the Republican capitals, but things that they invented themselves. And then very often the authorities saw that and said, wow, that's really interesting. Let us co-opt that into our repertoire and start doing it everywhere. And many things that we associate with the cult of the Great Patriotic War from the Brezhnev period actually started in the 1940s and 50s as local practices, very often in the western part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, etc. So, for example, the idea of meetings with war veterans in schools, or battlefield tourism, or even certain ways of celebrating Victory Day. All of this was invented locally. And of course, in the post-Soviet period, we could think of the St. George's Ribbon or the Immortal Regiment. All of these are things that really started as grassroots practices and then were kind of co-opted into the state repertoire, thereby changing that repertoire from within. And what's interesting is that this is now happening again in the Ukrainian case, where the occupiers discovered these practices of polychromy, and then they started producing photos and videos saying, well, for many, many years, sometimes for 8 years, sometimes during the Zelensky period, sometimes they claim during the entire period of Ukrainian independence, people in Ukraine were banned, prohibited from celebrating Victory Day, from assembling at war memorials, etc. And now finally Mother Russia is back and is allowing them to do all this, and look how creative they get in the process. And what's very interesting is that you can see here, this is a war memorial repainted in just the way that was kind of developed in Ukraine in the past decades, and it's presented as a new Russian practice. And what's interesting about this is that they take these practices and they kind of go wild with them. They exaggerate them so that they start, for example, repainting even statues that are made of bronze or of, bronze-like plastics, or they start filing reliefs or statues to also give them kind of a polychrome finish, which of course is contrary to all tradition regarding bronze monuments, but this is something that is very much done, especially in the first year of the Russian occupation. Here you see another example, also from Kherson, one of the several monuments to soldiers who died in Afghanistan, where you see a bronze statue of a grieving mother, and then it's repainted, the mother herself in black, and then the icon in gold color. So you see all sorts of really interesting commemorative creativity, one might call it. And then there is the construction of new monuments. So one example that many of you will already have heard of or seen is this one from Mariupol, where there was this famous story of the grandmother with the Soviet flag on the outskirts of Kharkiv, who greeted Russian soldiers because she was confused about what was happening. And she later said that, she wasn't actually pro-Russian, she meant something different, but it was taken up as a big motif in Russian war propaganda. And then very quickly, soon after the destruction and occupation of Mariupol, they installed this polymer plastic statue of this grandmother in Mariupol, which was then replicated in many other places, both in the occupied territories and in Russia. Another example also from Mariupol is this one. This was a very interesting monument to the fallen of the anti-terror operation, which once again, soon after the occupation of Mariupol, the Russians destroyed, as you can see here, and replaced with this gigantic equestrian statue of Alexander Nevsky. And this is particularly intriguing because, of course, Alexander Nevsky, a medieval Russian prince, had absolutely no relationship with the territory of present-day Ukraine, but he has become kind of a generic symbol of Russian imperial might. And according to the Russian perspective, Mariupol is now twinned with St. Petersburg. So this statue was cast in St. Petersburg and then transported to Mariupol. Another interesting phenomenon is the theft of monuments. So in September 2022, Kherson, along with other occupied regions, was officially declared to be part of Russia. And then very soon after that, the Russian army already started retreating because Kherson was being liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces. And the deputy governor and the governor of Kherson, appointed by the Russian side, said, well, this is a Russian city. It is now being attacked by Ukrainians, so we now have to protect our Russian heritage from this city. And we will do this by transporting it across the Dnipro, thereby saving it from the Ukrainians. And what they meant was that they would take statues, monuments built either before the Soviet period or during the Soviet period, or even during Ukrainian independence, statues mostly of 18th century military leaders who were, of course, the founders of Kherson in the Russian imperial period, and they would remove them and transport them to Russian-controlled territory. And they did that. They even took the mortal remains of Grigory Potemkin, all based on the claim that this was Russian cultural heritage that needed to be, so to say, protected from Ukraine. What's interesting is that in addition to this sort of nationalist argument, there was also an argument of personal ownership, because Volodymyr Saldo, who was the Russian-appointed governor of the Kherson region, had been the mayor of Kherson earlier when some of these statues were installed. So he kind of displayed a sense of personal ownership. He said that since these statues were installed under my authority, I now have the right to take them, and we will only bring them back to Kherson when it is Russian again. And then there's a whole story about art looting that Mykola has written a separate paper about. Another interesting aspect of Russian monument policies, and one that we have devoted a whole chapter to, is the visual semiotics of the presentation of war memorials. And we wrote this because, going through all the material that we had collected, we noticed some interesting patterns in the images and videos. So we realized that both sides in this war, both the Russian and the Ukrainian side, make very heavy use of images of war memorials. And this is an interesting theme because, of course, generally, when you think of monuments and memorials, their effect is not only in the location where they are physically situated, but also, of course, through visual representations. And this is something that is true of all times and places. It was especially important in the Soviet Union. I've written a whole paper about the visual representation of war memorials in Soviet and post-Soviet history textbooks. And here you can see it in action in wartime. So what happens on the Russian side? So first of all, war memorials from the Soviet period are used as backdrops that confer a certain authority or legitimacy to whoever is speaking in front of them. And what they are saying does not even have to have anything to do with war memorials. Just the fact of speaking in front of a memorial gives them the authority to speak about, Russian power or future reconstruction, etc., etc. Another interesting motif is people being presented in an expert position because they're speaking in front of war memorials. And usually they're talking about how Russia is renovating these memorials, reconstructing them. But if you listen closely to what they say, you notice that, in fact, often they don't even know where they are. They don't know anything about the memorial that they are talking about. And sometimes they make, egregious mistakes. So, for example, they say, this is a statue that's located in a small village in the kolkhoz, where in fact it's in a big city, etc. So even though they have no actual expertise on the territory that they're talking about, this visual association between a war memorial and a speaker endows them with authority in the eyes of the intended audience, which is of course located in Russia and also typically knows relatively little about the details of these territories. And then another very typical mode of visual presentation is the use of low angles. And in visual semiotics, low angles are usually associated with hierarchy, right? And as you can see very clearly here, there is a visual hierarchy between the Great Patriotic War Memorial from the Soviet period, which is located in the upper half of the photo, and therefore more important, and the present day soldiers who are not only in the lower half, but in fact they're even copying, replicating the pose of that memorial in order to sort of prove themselves worthy of the great generation that won the Second World War. So there's a clear indication of hierarchy. The Russian soldiers are continuing the great deeds, the great feats of their ancestors, but they are clearly placed in a lower position. This is something that's shown very often. Here is a wonderful example of people actually reenacting the whole pose of a very famous monument. Once again, this is very interesting for me because I worked on this monument in archives in Kiev a few years ago, and I read the discussions between architects during its construction. And one of the things they were actually talking about is how this monument, when it was going to be built, would look in textbooks as a silhouette. So this, in a sense, corresponds to the intended use of this monument when it was built in the early 50s in what was then Krasnodon. And another use of low angles is to create a sense of sanctity by associating monuments with eternal flames. And there are many examples of this. Here, once again, you have an example of hierarchy and sort of expression of awe and respect. And this is also something that is conveyed through the use of wide angles. As you can see here, especially when the monuments in question are very large, right? So here you get a sense of the sort of the awe that is inspired by this gigantic symbol of Soviet heroism and victory, and the living soldiers in comparison are very small and once again are clearly placed in kind of an inferior position. And another use of wide angles is to show how supposedly under Ukrainian rule, Soviet-era memorials became completely dilapidated and nobody took care of them. Or to express the idea that these memorials have to be protected from imaginary Ukrainian attackers, which is of course paradoxical because these monuments survived in excellent shape throughout the 30 years of Ukrainian independence, and nobody ever tried to attack them. But once again, for a domestic audience, it's very important to sort of create a visual narrative of Ukrainian threat and Russian protection. Now, for the sake of comparison, it's very interesting to look at the presentation of war memorials in Ukrainian war propaganda, where they are also quite frequently used, but the visual semiotics here is somewhat different. So a very typical mode of presentation is a selfie-style photo or video, where you also get a Soviet-era Second World War memorial, Great Patriotic War Memorial, and a person speaking now, but they are put on an equal footing. And this photo, this screenshot is especially interesting in this regard because here this is taken to an extreme whereby you don't even see the head of the main statue. The important thing is simply to indicate that it is there. And the function here, of course, is to also create a sense of continuity between the victims of the Second World War or the heroes of the Second World War and present-day Ukrainians, but it's a continuity on a much more equal footing. It seems to say, well, you know, they were protecting the country against fascist invaders, and here we are having to deal with the same shit again. So this is one example, and another frequent mode of visual presentation is to show a war memorial, Soviet-era war memorial, amid a scenery of destruction to sort of symbolize Ukraine's fighting spirit, surrounded by the destruction wrought by the Russian invasion. And this, of course, evokes parallels with iconic photos of monuments standing tall amid ruined cityscapes in the First World War, or Arras in this case, or the Second World War, Dresden, etc. And what's interesting is that some Soviet-era war memorials, especially the Motherland statue in Kyiv, are very frequently reimagined as symbolic expressions of Ukrainian nationhood, Ukrainian resilience, the Ukrainian fighting spirit, where people point out that the statue is looking towards Moscow. They, even before the symbol on the statue's shield was actually changed, people already redrew the statue to make it look more Ukrainian. They drew anime videos about it, etc. And there were so many different reimaginations of this statue sort of going into battle for Ukraine alongside present-day soldiers that the Museum of Ukraine in the Second World War, which is located inside the pedestal of the statue, actually organized an entire exhibition of such images and drawings and videos as early as the summer of 2022. So both sides use these images, but in very different ways. And now finally, let's get to indirect effects of the invasion. So as I mentioned, there was a claim on the part of Russia that Ukraine was systematically destroying Soviet-era memorials to the Second World War, which was almost entirely untrue. But in response to the invasion and in response to Russia actually laying a claim to these memorials and even using them as justification for the invasion, people actually started removing some of these war memorials. And if you've read anything about this in the media, you've probably come across sentences such as, all across Europe, Soviet war memorials are coming down. And in fact, this is a vast exaggeration. So we actually looked at the geography of this new iconoclasm since 2022, and we found that this only happened systematically as part of a top-down government policy in 4 countries, specifically Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Poland is the one country where this kind of systematic removal of Soviet war memorials started even earlier in 2017, and it was in 2022, it was kind of replicated by the Baltic countries. There are 2 countries, Czechia and Bulgaria, where 1 or 2 Soviet war memorials have been removed since 2022. The Ukrainian case is actually quite interesting because in Ukraine there's a huge regional diversity. So in the Lviv region, partly in the Ivano-Frankivsk and Ternopil regions, there has been systematic removal. So there's a kind of close collaboration between Ukrainian iconoclastic activists who advocate the systematic removal of all Soviet memorials and the regional authorities. But in all other regions of Ukraine, no such thing has happened. So there have been individual cases of removal. Usually it's at the initiative or on the decision of some local or regional council. There have also been individual cases of activists taking matters into their own hands and just, removing a monument overnight or something. But there's been no systematic removal of war memorials, specifically in most Ukrainian regions. And what's interesting is that there are even a few countries, even outside the former Soviet Union, the countries that you see in blue on this map, Hungary, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia, where new memorials to Soviet Red Army soldiers from the Second World War have been installed since 2022. So this claim that they're coming down everywhere is a simplification and an exaggeration. But what happened is that I will not show examples from the other countries. Is that even in the Ukrainian case, where activists and some politicians and some members of regional governments have pushed for removal, this has often been met with resistance from local residents. And this resistance can take very creative shapes. So sometimes, this is an example Mykola found recently, they will surround a Second World War memorial with a kind of fence made of portraits of the fallen of the ongoing war, thereby associating the 2 wars with each other as kind of 2 parts of Ukraine's history of resistance against foreign invasion, and making it almost physically impossible to remove a memorial. Or sometimes they simply push back. So this is a very interesting case in the Transcarpathian region, where one Ukrainian activist wrote letters actually to lots of different village councils in this region, saying, you have a Soviet war memorial in your village. This is a statue of a Soviet soldier. thereby, representing Soviet imperialism, colonialism, etc., you have to remove this. And in this case, he got a reply from the village council saying, we have considered your request. We got together as a council of village residents, and we decided that this is not a Soviet soldier. This is a monument to sons of our village who died defending it from foreign invasion and occupation, just as now Ukrainians are defending our country also from foreign invasion. So we see no reason to remove this memorial. And this is linked to what I talked about at the very beginning, the sort of domestication and appropriation of local war memorials, where they are really seen as part of the local landscape and even of family history, rather than symbols of the Soviet era or the Soviet state or anything like that. So the monument landscape, or the monumentscape as we called it in our book, in Ukraine remains very complicated. And we just yesterday we submitted a new paper where we talk about the relationship between memorials to the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war and the Second World War memorials in Ukraine, and the way in which it used to be the case that Second World War memorials provided legitimacy, and people would add new monuments to them, monuments to Soviet soldiers who fought in Afghanistan, to the Chernobyl liquidators, to people who participate in other military interventions, etc., because the Great Patriotic War was the source of all legitimacy. So by being symbolically close to the Great Patriotic War, you could sort of get a part of that legitimacy. And this is something that, of course, continues to be the case in Russia or in Belarus. But in Ukraine, now the relationship is almost reversed, whereby the Great Patriotic War memorials now have a doubtful legitimacy because there is a movement to get rid of them. And people are now adding monuments or memorials to the dead of the ongoing war to them in order to protect them from destruction, by stressing that these are parts of this common history of protecting Ukraine from invasion. This is these are quotes from this letter. I'll show you the map again, and then I guess I will stop the presentation here, and I will be happy to answer your questions. And if Mykola is with us, oh yeah, I can see.
Yes, yes.
You're in a stationary location now.
Yes.
So maybe I will shut up now and you will answer all the questions.
Thank you, Mischa, for fascinating storytelling. Better next time.
He's the one who collected like 90% of the material. So even though I was the one talking today, all your applause should go to Mykola.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't know, do you have some questions? I have a little question for you, Mischa. It was really interesting, but I'm interested in what was your methodology to take this statistic about war memorial in Europe, in Ukraine, in Russia. I think it's very huge. What kind of methodology did you use it?
And I think there are two questions in there, right? You're asking about the map on the one hand, but then maybe also about how we collected material for the book.
Yeah, it's especially about the methodology and how you collected this kind of information.
So maybe I'll briefly talk about the map, and then Mykola can talk about the book more generally. So with the map, it's actually quite simple. With the 4 countries that do have a systematic iconoclastic policy, it's relatively obvious because there are laws, there are big debates in the media. I've been to these countries. I've seen many examples of people actually removing memorials, etc. For the other countries, I mean, I've been working on Soviet war memorials for a long time, and basically I followed the media, and I also started asking people I know in each of these countries, can you actually name any examples of war memorials being removed? And sometimes they would say, oh yes, there is an example here. And then when we looked at it closely, we saw that Well, actually, it wasn't removed. It was just graffiti, right? So basically, you know, I proceeded kind of through a method of elimination. Can we find an actual example of something being removed in this country, right? And if not, then it's green. So that was a relatively sort of easy part of the research. But maybe Mykola cannot talk about the book as such.
As we use different sources, first of all, on-site observation made by me and by Mischa as well. Mischa also visited Ukraine during the war, and we actually firstly met in person during the war in the city of Odessa. Except of on-site observation, except for field research, we also use many sources from internet. I mean, Telegram channels, web newspapers, news agencies, social media, different type of social media. First of all, Telegram channels, especially I would say temporary or ephemeral Telegram channels. Part of them don't exist anymore, and also we use interviews with witnesses who survive during the occupation from different countries. And one more method is exploring. I call it archaeological exploring, or not like archaeology, archaeological exploring of commemorative sites before event, because it was quite dangerous to explore different events and what had happened around monuments on the same day, on the same time. The one way how to understand what had happened there was to explore the remains of commemorative practices, observing remains of I don't know, wreaths, candles, flowers, ribbons with different expressions, and also remains, digital remains of commemoration from Telegram sources, Telegram channels, and other internet sources. Maybe I forget to add something. What else?
Thank you very much. Alexandra, it's you have a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. And I have a question just in continuation to what Mykola just said about the rituals. Because you mentioned a bit in the presentation that, and definitely it should be so, that some new commemorative practices and like commemorative rituals appeared around old monuments. I understand that there are some local specific connected to these monuments and connected to some events, occupation or the freedom of the territories. But if there is some peculiarities and differences on the one hand between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine in these commemoration practices, on the other hand, is there any difference, or did you discover this difference between this rethinking, remaking of old Soviet monuments, war monuments, memorials in the Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine?
Yes, thank you for your question. Of course, there are a lot of differences between regions, but there is no any serious gap between rituals, practices in Western, Eastern, Southern, Central Ukraine. Polychromia you can meet everywhere, both in South and Western and Eastern Ukraine. Differences it's about intensivity of using, for instance, polychromy. The more bright polychromy is on the East Ukraine. But also there are many very interesting examples in Western Ukraine about different type of modification. We also met all mentioned type of modification in all Ukrainian regions. I mean, except of polychromy, nationalization, individualization, adding religious symbols. Maybe one is different that it's not a qualitative, this quantitative difference. For instance, religious symbols, installing religious symbols, crosses is more common for Western Ukraine. It's the higher level of religiosity in this part of Ukraine. But also there are such examples in Eastern Ukraine. So the main difference is not a qualitative, but just quantitative. And commemorative practices and war memorials say us about this gap between Eastern and Western Ukraine is exaggeration.
Thank you very much, Boris. Please.
I have I have a question. Maybe firstly, I would like to say that Mischa, in his first words, dropped out the first part of the book, which is theoretical. And it seems to me that it's also very interesting. Okay, I'll try to continue. So I would like to thank for the presentation, because there were a lot of interesting moments. And for example, we can see how this monuments works or acts like an agent in the such a Latour way of thinking. But my question concerns maybe the theoretical part of the book, and my question is rather abstract. Can you explain, or can you say something on the what was it relevant for you to make differences between to draw and to discuss the practices of differentiation between the Soviet, Russian, and Ukrainian, because I think that this case, this materials is very interesting in this perspective. And for example, there was one place in the book where you say that, for example, Russian troops or Russian invaders make something which was rather common for Soviet practices. It was a rebuilding of the monuments, yes. And my question is, what we can say about these different practices which you observed? Are they continue some Soviet tradition, or are they make break with Soviet tradition? How in different aspects or in different contexts maybe these relations between Soviet, Russian, and Ukrainian exist or are produced? Thank you.
Mykola, would you like to start?
I think it's a question for you.
Okay, so I mean, we could talk about this for 2 hours, I guess. So just maybe to mention some of the theoretical contributions that we try to make in the theoretical chapter. So first of all, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're talking about a situation where there are many, many different monuments of a certain type, and we wanted to find a way to do justice to all of them. So we developed this concept of a monumentscape, which signifies that you cannot really understand much about monuments and war memorials, in particular in Ukraine, but also in other places, if you only look at a few individual well-known examples. You have to think about how they are distributed, what different types there are, and how the very fact that these types of monuments are so ubiquitous affects the way that people interact with them, right? So in Ukraine, for example, people know that whichever village you go to, you can always expect to find a certain type of Soviet war memorial, right? And this, of course, changes your relationship with war memorials compared to a situation where, in order to see a war memorial, you would have to go to one particular city as part of a tourist trip or something. And once we established that, we thought in terms of a collective biography of monuments, right? So other people, like James E. Young, for example, writing about Holocaust memorials, have used this idea of a biography of monuments, that you talk not just about what it looks like, what it's supposed to represent, but what actually happens to a monument over the course of its life, from when people start planning it, discussing it, to when it is built, but then also to all the different practices that surround it, etc. And we sort of expanded this term because we wanted to talk about a collective biography, right? Instead of talking about what happens to one specific monument, we talk about all these different changes that happen to a monument over the course of its lifetime. And the collage that you see on the cover of the book is supposed to symbolize this, because these are photos taken by Mykola of one particular monument, first in its kind of original Soviet state, where it's unpainted, and then painted in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, and then the way it was modified under Russian occupation, when this Ukrainian flag was repainted in the red colors of the Soviet flag, right? So this was sort of our way to frame the topic theoretically. We talk a lot about iconoclasm and sort of different types of iconoclasm and what that means, and the fact that in the Russian case, there's no philosophical iconoclasm. It's not like in the Islamic tradition or in some parts of the Orthodox tradition where you want to get rid of images in general. You want to get rid of a specific type of images. But what's interesting is that, and this kind of connects our topic with other instances of iconoclasm throughout history. What was very important for the Russian iconoclasts in this case was that as many people as possible should see them being iconoclasts. So the important thing about destroying an image was not just the act of destroying it, but the act of showing to a large audience that you're destroying it. And there's a wonderful book by Aaron Tugendhaft, The Idols of Isis, where he compares iconoclasm in ancient Assyria with what ISIS did in Iraq, a few years ago, and he shows that there are some lines of continuity, which we also find in this case. And then we engage with this concept of agonism that is very fashionable in memory studies, where people talk about, we have different views of memory, certain historical events, and we should all just agree to disagree, essentially. And we argue that, that's a nice idea, but it doesn't really work in a case such as the one of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because it presupposes that everybody agrees to disagree. Whereas, Russia doesn't agree to disagree. It basically imposes its own vision through the use of force. So we need a different kind of conceptual language here. And that conceptual language we found with the notion of imperial irredentism. Right. So we try to inscribe the Russian invasion of Ukraine in a history of imperial irredentism and the use of monuments and heritage in the justification of imperial irredentism, which is kind of the claim to certain lands not because they belong to your nation, but because they supposedly belong to your empire. And it's very interesting to compare this to other cases because it's not the only case in history where people have something that is a shared heritage, but then they say, well, we are the only ones who know what to do with this heritage, really. So, and one interesting example we found is what the British and French did in the Levant in the 1920s during the Mandate period after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, where they got a mandate from the League of Nations to basically establish a military presence in what later became Lebanon and Syria. And they said, well, one reason why we must be here is that we are civilized white Christian Europeans, and there are all these crusader castles here. All this legacy of the Christian period of this region. And of course, we are the only ones who know what to do with this, because all these barbarian, Arabs and Muslims, they don't know anything. What's interesting and what also makes this sort of parallel to the Russian-Ukrainian case is that, in fact, of course, they did not. So the discourse was that we will now just reestablish kind of a continuity with the medieval Crusader period and just forget about what all these barbarians did. But instead, of course, what they did in practice is that they took practices that had been established under Ottoman rules of heritage protection, and they kind of turned them into their own. And this is similar to what, as we showed in the presentation, Russia did in Ukraine, where they took practices developed locally in the Ukrainian case and started sort of presenting them as their own, thereby changing their own commemorative repertoire from within. And this also goes to the part of the question about the Soviet tradition. So, I mean, my answer, first of all, would be what I already said during the presentation. There's this kind of dialectics of co-optation and change. And this is very much part of the Soviet tradition, right? The Soviet tradition was not actually, the Soviet Union was one of the very few countries in Europe that never had a centralized agency that took care of war memorials. Unlike Britain, France, Italy, Germany, etc., the Soviet Union didn't have that because it wasn't established after the First World War, because the Soviet Union didn't care about the First World War. So instead, they had this sort of dialectic where they kept discovering things that people would develop locally, and then co-opting that into the repertoire and changing it from within. So that, I think, is a part of the Soviet tradition that's continuing now. Another part is what you referred to, I think, which is Julie Deschapelle's work on kind of the Soviet mode of heritage protection, whose hallmark was that we want to protect things by destroying them. We will destroy them and then build them back better. Right? We will create something that's even better, and it's the same thing, just an improved version. And we found that. I mean, we refer to her work on at several occasions in our book, and we think that's a very kind of good way of making sense of what they're doing. And then practices of differentiation between Soviet Russian and Ukrainian. I don't know, Mykola, do you want to talk about that?
Yes, I can add that, of course, Ukraine took some rituals, some traditions from Soviet Union, as continuing Soviet tradition, like eternal flame. But also Ukraine took a few traditions from Russian contemporary Russian practices, like immortal regiment or what else?
I mean, even the St. George's ribbon up to a certain period.
Yes, and the banner of victory in mass, and also time to time I also observe from Medvedev's time establishing this honor title of City of Warriors honor, and I saw a different examples. I made different examples in Ukraine when first what came to my mind is city of Lazova from Kharkiv region, who was honored by themselves as a city of military glory of Ukraine. And the tradition of city of heroes is a Soviet tradition, actually. And after the full-scale aggression, President Zelensky awarded 10 Ukrainian cities by this title. This is also a continuity of Soviet tradition.
I guess, I mean, maybe I can add just one thing. What I find particularly interesting is that in Ukraine, there's actually a very sort of interesting and rich debate, and a very controversial debate about what is Ukrainian, what is Soviet, what is Russian, how can we combine these things? Whereas in Russia, what I'm observing now is kind of the assumption that whatever is part of the Russian commemorative repertoire now is just, the Soviet way of doing things, even if the Russian cultural commemoration has actually changed enormously since the Soviet period. I mean, in the Soviet period, there were no St. George's ribbons, there were no immortal regiments, there were no Orthodox priests marching in Victory Day processions, etc. But the soldiers come in with a combination of the red banner of victory, the Jesus Christ gonfalon, and the Russian flag. And for them, that is normal, and they don't see a discrepancy. There's no cognitive dissonance in their mind between that and the Soviet war memorials, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, Ladislav, please.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I also have a question a bit connected to what Alexandra asked already, but from the other side. Did you find some peculiarities in memorial culture in Russian occupied territories compared to general Russian narrative? Because if I understand correctly, we are talking about local memorial culture in Russian occupied territories as something which was born and practiced in between Ukrainian narrative and Russian narrative. But did you find probably something precisely local, some commemorative practices or something which was made by locals as locals, not as Russians or Ukrainians?
Actually, what is the most important, this is observed, this fusion between local Ukrainian tradition and what occupiers demands when they came to Ukraine. And this is fusion time to time was quite bizarre, actually, maybe, and it shows the syncretism which won Ukrainian diversity, Ukrainian syncretism, who actually won a Russian centralized policy. This is maybe it's a strange conclusion, but for me, it one of the most our finding was our observation when local tradition, democratic folk tradition won authoritarian commemorative practices.
It's a very interesting question, actually, and it's not a simple one because I'm not sure it's very easy to define local in the context of Soviet and post-Soviet war commemoration. Because, so for example, even before the end of the Second World War, people in Ukraine and other places in the Soviet Union started celebrating local liberation days, right? Even before the 9th of May existed as a date, people already celebrated in some ways that would later become associated with Victory Day, the liberation of particular cities. Now, is this a local tradition? Well, yes, of course, because it's local, it happens on certain dates that are specific to that locality. But then, of course, if you look at what people actually do, it's not that different from other places, right? So there might be a concert or a parade or some sports event or something. So it's not entirely clear whether this is a local tradition. I mean, I know some examples from the Soviet period of local traditions, like the Kepka procession in Novorossiysk in Russia, things like that. But I don't know to what extent that's really, makes it very specifically local. So it's not actually an easy question to answer, I don't think.
Okay, thank you.
Somebody, I think Sasha or son here.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for your wonderful and I don't know, unbelievable actually research, and for the work you've done and still doing. And my question is maybe for some rather peculiar moment. It's understandable and it's obvious that the main, I don't know, imaginary, the main part of the past that was used, abused, reused in these practices of monuments. It's mainly the wars of the 20th century. Yeah, first the Second World War and some other wars, Afghanistan War. In your presentation and in your book, you mentioned maybe I've lost something. If you're talking about the book, you've mentioned only one case of using the image of the person not from this. Not from the 20th century. It was Alexander Nevsky in case of Mariupol. Maybe were there any other cases of monuments from earlier time, personal monuments or other that were used in Russian propaganda during occupation, or were reinterpreted during in other cases in Ukraine? Thank you.
Mykola, do you want to start talking? I will try to look for photos from the Kalka.
Yes. Thank you for your question. Yes. Occupiers tried to deal with any military monuments and in all and different types of holidays related to military history, Russian military history. And our book contained the table with a long list of celebrated by Russian occupiers holidays on site around of war memorials. This list include, for instance, celebrating of the day of imagined day of a battle between on the river of Kalka. This is a battle between some of Russian princes with Mongolians in 20th century, and also we have a case from Lugansk Oblast from a monument dedicated to Prince Igor, also a Russian prince from early medieval time, early in Western Europe dimension. And also there were several attempts to work with memory of First World War. So the list of war memorials and military holidays was not limited just by Second World War, Afghanistan war, but was quite long.
So can you see this video that I'm trying to show?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the example that Mykola referred to. This commemoration of the Battle of the Kalka River, which actually started before 2022, and it's a really fascinating, sort of completely anachronistic way of representing this history, with talking about Cossacks, about a period where there were no Cossacks involved in these military operations, and then, as you could see, I think in the video, they combined that with the Soviet victory banner, and there's even an attempt to create here a kind of wooden church architecture type memorial to sort of present this as a Russian national history. But interestingly, this is something that you find from both sides, right? So, for example, in Ukraine, very often when they removed Lenin statues during the Lenin fall, they replaced them with monuments to defenders of Ukraine throughout the ages, or people who fought against Russian invasion throughout the ages. And throughout the ages really means from Volodymyr, the medieval prince, to the Ato soldiers. right? So it's kind of something I once called pan-historical militarism in an article about Russia. So it's very common in Russia, where you often have these galleries of, from the Vitezi to the Spetsnazovцы, and in Ukraine there's kind of a similar logic, of course, and often you have these kind of hybrid memorials where all these people are put together. But what's interesting in the Ukrainian case is that sometimes they're also put together with their ideological enemies. So sometimes you will have like members of UPA being honored with a memorial next to a monument to the victims of UPA from the Soviet period. And lots of people have written about this. Yulia Yurchuk and Matthias Kaltenbrunner writing about a particular village in Western Ukraine shows a very good example of this. So there's also a kind of syncretism, but this pan-historical militarism, I think you find in both countries and also in other post-Soviet countries.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
I have a really little question. Do you have some reference to the figure of Alexander the Great in this? No?
I don't think so.
No.
Did you see anything?
Okay.
This is big in Northern Macedonia, of course.
Yeah, but it's interesting. For instance, in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, you can have it. It's like on the very important personality for Uzbek history. But this is my question. Thank you. I don't know. Somebody have any questions? No? Yes? I would like to ask another questions. You analyzed the war monuments. Did you study it or not? Another kind of monuments and the memories on only some things linking to the war.
Mykola, talk about Lenin.
Actually, I didn't understand your question.
I'd like to know, you make your study about the war monuments and the memorial. Did you study it or not? Another kind or another type of monuments? I don't know about literature. I think about Pushkin or the Lenin or all historical personalities.
I see.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Yes. Mm-hmm. About Lenin, yes, Lenin monuments are on focus of my personal research because it was and also we mentioned this case in our book as well, but it's not a central part of our book. Just briefly, we read about Lenin monuments. This one more interesting phenomenon: the re-erecting of Lenin statues in occupied territory, and the first monuments, Lenin monuments, were re-erected in the city of Genishevsk in the beginning of the invasion in April. This is in the middle of the April, and we observed a wave of such behavior, wave of erecting of Lenin statues. But it's interesting that wave or stopped after 1.5 and 2 years. And actually, this is my research in progress, and I have a few hypotheses that the relations to Lenin in Russia is changing. Maybe already has changed. It's Lenin is not the main historical figure in contemporary Russia. Even more, this historical figure treated in a negative way by Putin personally, and we have also many examples when examples about discussion in Russian cities about future of Lenin monuments, and there are a few examples when Lenin were removed from central squares to the periphery, and the Ukrainian occupied territory was the site when people, supporters of communism and Lenin's, have such freedom, commemorative freedom, and the occupied territory during the 2 years was the site, the place when practices forbidden in Russian Federations people could execute, and after when the territory was captured and new order was established in there, this wave of erecting of Lenin's status stopped. And it's also interesting case with Lenin's.
Thank you very much. You don't know if there are other questions? No? No. If not, I would like say again, thank you very much for your presentations, for the book also. And I think we will read your book very, very quickly. And thank you.